Welcome to German October, a timeline where Trotsky manages to conquer Poland and northern Germany for the Soviet Union, giving him incredible political influence. As the chaos of Lenin's death causes significant political instability, strong leadership is desired by many. Stalin seems keen to continue Lenin's legacy, but Trotsky would rapidly return to Moscow in order to avoid what he would call the Stalin coup from occurring. In our history, Trotsky would be disgraced by Stalin and exiled following Lenin's death. But would the prestige of conquering Poland and Germany be enough to protect Trotsky from suffering the same fate as our history? How will Stalin's allies of the Triumvirate react to the advent of Lenin's last testament? Let's jump back into the timeline where we left off. In conventional history, we usually think of the leader of the Soviet Union being Stalin after Lenin, but there was a period where the collective leadership was still de jure the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. However, Stalin is still considered the leader at this point of time by most people due to the strength of his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party. For example, the chairman of the CPC was supposed to work directly together with each of the leaders of the Soviet republics of the Union, as a form of collective leadership following Leninist ideals. However, the GSCP was able to remove and elevate any and all positions within the Communist Party. This position allowed for Stalin to improve the standing of his allies, and was key in his bid to gain leadership of the Union after the constitutional revision of 1936, which formalized the GSCP as the head of state of the Soviet Union. So therefore, despite the sheer legendary status Trotsky would have for his victory in Germany, there would be no way for Trotsky to simply claim the position of CPC. Stalin would need to be removed from his position as GSCP beforehand. Thankfully, Lenin, as he was nearing his deathbed, had written a letter outlining his wishes for the future of the Soviet Union. This letter had, in our timeline, advocated for Trotsky. Lenin had said not to hold his hesitancy to join the Bolshevik Revolution against him, criticized several members of the party, and voiced his wishes for the General Secretary position to be granted to someone else other than Stalin. Lenin's last testament had gotten into the hands of the two other members of the Stalin Triumvirate, Kamenev and Zinoviev. In our timeline, they had relayed the existence of this document to Stalin as a part of their triumvirate. However, ever since Stalin had become GSCP, he had managed to gain far more influence than Kamenev and Zinoviev, leaving them worried for their future. This worry would be absolutely justified, as years later, Stalin would have these people purged, with the accusation being that they were attempting to put Trotsky in charge of the Soviet Union. In this timeline, I believe that these scorned members of the triumvirate would betray Stalin and align with Trotsky. Their motivations would be very clear-cut. They want to keep their position of influence as equals in a triumvirate, and wish to side with the rising influence of Trotsky rather than Stalin, who had, in their eyes, betrayed the terms of the triumvirate. So when the next party congress would convene, Trotsky and Stalin would face off. The conference, which had ultimately humiliated Trotsky and had him exiled out of the Soviet Union, would instead be reversed, where Trotsky would ridicule Stalin for his failure to listen to orders from Lenin, forcing Trotsky to deal with the devil and only liberate half of Germany. Trotsky would accuse Stalin of attempting to form a fifth column and undermine the revolutionary effort. Using Lenin's last testament as a means to depose him from his position, and the accusations of treason, he would be exiled by Trotsky out of the Soviet Union itself. After Stalin's ordered exile, Trotsky would continue to read Lenin's last testament, which would have been far more in favor of Trotsky due to his successes. This alternate last testament would call for Trotsky to become head of the government, which at the time of the first Soviet constitution would be the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, removing the former chairman, Alexei Rykov. The vacant seat of the GSCP would be granted to Karl Radek, who was a major ally of Trotsky during the German October Revolution. Now, Trotsky would continue to consolidate the Soviet Union under his vision, emboldened by the truth of his ideology and the scale of his achievements. With the rise of Trotsky to leadership of the Soviet Union, the capitalist world would tremble. Trotsky's ideological interpretation of communism had called for a global revolution of industrial workers, supported by direct military intervention. On top of this, the financial burdens of the Great War, which were supposed to be alleviated by the German war reparations, were now null and void due to the lack of a Germany to pay them off. The level of crisis that was perpetuating across the Western world would be immense. And yet, despite all of this, French troops supporting the Rhinish and Baden-Württembergian separatist states had managed to fend off the beleaguered Soviet forces. Regardless of the efforts of the Soviet army, it could very well be that the French and British socialists would attempt their own revolutions to split the attention of the army and ultimately lead to their liberation. But even that would be prevented by the stipulations of the Treaty of Trier. Any attempts to trigger a communist revolution in these countries could not be directly supported by the Soviet Union. So the Comintern would advise that the communists of the world continue to organize, but not take any direct action just yet. The Treaty of Trier had ensured that this uneasy peace between the Soviets and the West would persist, giving both factions the opportunity to regain their footing. While both factions would benefit from the truce, the Soviets would benefit far more, as Soviet access to German industry would allow for the economically backwards regions of the former Russian Empire to industrialize rapidly, allowing for the Soviets to return with far more technologically advanced arms to break the defenses of the French and spread the revolution to Europe. Thus, the Entente powers of the Great War would all seek to band together once again in order to properly prepare themselves against the Soviet Union. France and Britain would continue to foster their friendship, despite the natural distancing which occurred following the end of the Great War, and would attempt to reach out to Italy, a former Entente member. However, diplomacy between the former allies would be difficult, as the new Prime Minister of Italy, Yes Man, was quite fashionable and held disdain for their former allies. Before the outbreak of the Great War, Italy was in between two major alliances, the Central Powers and the Entente. Despite signing a defensive pact with the Germans and Austrians, the Italians were eventually swayed to the side of the Entente with the Treaty of London, where the British had guaranteed to the Italians that they would gain these territories if they joined the Entente. However, due to American intervention and Wilson's 14 points, the gained territories were far less, especially in the case of Yugoslavia, a French-supported state among their ambitions of cordon sanitaire at the expense of Italian irredenta. This distrust in the West, as well as fear of a socialist revolution, led to the rise of Yes Man and his fashionistas to power in the state. Italy under Yes Man was a nationalistic dictatorship that sought to claim the territories denied to them by the Western powers, as well as lands off of the British and French that were considered a fundamental part of Greater Italy. This claiming Western territory, their anti-democratic nature, and the distrust that they felt towards their former allies would make diplomacy difficult. But the advent of the Soviet advance into Europe provided Yes Man a unique opportunity to carve out their own sphere of influence. Italian fashion was extremely anti-Bolshevik, and due to the nature of Yes Man's rise to power, many capitalist nations would start to see this new 20th century fashion trend as one that these nations had ought to adopt. And by becoming a major partner in this alliance against Bolshevism, Italy would be able to promote their fashion amongst the terrified nations of the West, giving Italy the opportunity to act once they are properly industrialized. Thus, Italy would join the British and French in an alliance against the rising power in the German region. Ironically enough, the German October timeline has a more reasonable Stresa Front than Project Stresa does. But Italy would also sign other important treaties with Austria and Hungary, seeking to improve their relations, promote Italian fashion trends, and potentially postured themselves against Yugoslavia, whom each had territorial ambitions against. With the aggressive posturing of the Italians against the French and their cordon sanitaire, tensions would increase between the two powers. But with the solidification of the Stresa Front, there would be no actions France could take to the Italians and their spread of influence. Only time will tell if this united front would last beyond the vanquishing of the communist threat. But for now, we'll explore the plan of attack of the Stresa Front. With the Soviet annexation of Poland and Germany, they had direct land access to the industrial heartlands of Germany. However, it also provided them a significant vulnerability. With the French-aligned states of Czechoslovakia and Romania just next door to Poland, the Stresa Front could simply make a concentrated advance into Poland and cut off the connection from Russia to Germany, where they would then finish off the German Soviets before performing a large-scale invasion into Russia herself. This advance into Poland would be supported by the Polish resistance, who had established themselves in Czechoslovakia after capitulating to the Soviet Union. While still very much committed to the ideal of an independent Poland, it was apparent to many within the exiled government that standing alone would not be an option. With the bonds they forged together fending off Soviet advances into Czechoslovakia, the idea of including Poland into the Czechoslovak Union was considered. This Zapadoslavia would be founded after the destruction of the Soviet Union, and would ensure that the West Slavians would never again be subjugated to either Germans, Russians, or Communists. While there were still many adamantly Polish nationalists among the ranks of the Polish exiles, this idea of a stronger Central European nation loyal to France was strongly supported by France. For now, however, these were only hypotheticals, and were secondary to the primary strategy of encircling Germany away from the rest of the Soviet Union. Trotsky was fully aware of all the ways that the capitalists could potentially eliminate the workers' state. Thus, he would waste no time industrializing the most loyal of the Soviet republics, Russia. In order to do this, he would bargain with the German Soviet Socialist Republic in order to gain their full material and intellectual support. While this seems like a no-brainer for the good of the revolution, the Germans would be apprehensive. To put a complicated concept simply, if the Germans industrialized the Russians, they would be obsolete. The Soviets would have gotten what they wanted out of the North Germans, and would have no incentive to reunify Germany, keeping the status quo. In order to dispel this anxiety of the Germans, Trotsky had promised the Germans that once Russia was pulled out of its feudal roots, the Russians would pay back the German proletariat with a unified German Soviet Republic. With the consent of the Germans, the Trotsky 5-year plan would begin, with a very large emphasis on railway networks and the industrialization of the former Imperial Russian lands. However, Trotsky's public proclamation of their intentions to invade the German breakaway states had the adverse effect of increasing world tension, causing the weary nations of Europe to band closer together. The world would wait anxiously as the capitalist nations of Europe would one way or another pursue their own 5-year plans in anticipation of a large conflict with the USSR. However, to the surprise of many, it wouldn't be 5 years before another major conflict. It would only manifest 1 year later, with the inciting incident not even being in Europe, but instead, China. What could have possibly happened in China for there to be such a large conflict? Who would be involved? How would the world react to the Soviets marching east rather than west? All of these questions and more will be answered in episode 3 as the Soviets invade China to spread the revolution. Thanks for watching episode 2 of German October. I know it's been a lot of build-up, a lot of things going on, but we're finally getting into the main crux, the main conflict of the series. I really hope you enjoy what I have cooked up. Shout out to Enzo Rafael Souza Silva, Louis Avant, Grud, Jubs, Solo Leo, and I Love Hoi For I Swear for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Take care of your family, and I hope you have a good day. Bye bye, Lord Boy.
Bye bye.
Have a good day.
Press the button.
If you press this button, then it'll stop. Press this on the mouse.
No.
Just click here. Press this one.
This one?
Yeah.